on the other one, you bastard!
Despite a few recent hiccups in Earthrise as a whole,
the War for Cybertron trilogy
has been received quite well. Now that everyone is in the swing of things, we can clearly tell what the line is trying to do and how it's going to go about doing so. However, there's one prominent element of the first two installments of the trilogy that everyone seems to ignore. I am of course talking about the Micromasters, and surprisingly these have received a lot of backlash. The general consensus is that these aren't as good as figures in the same price points in lines prior, and people are really pining for that classic Legends experience, which I kinda get because that's how I got into the franchise. But personally I just can't get behind this sentiment. There's a lot of fun to be had if you just give these figures a shot, so I think it's time to set the record straight. Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and after much delay, today's diagnosis pertains to Wave 3, 4, and 5 of the War for Cybertron Siege Micromasters. So as alluded to a few sentences ago, it's been so long since I reviewed Waves 1 and 2 that some explanation might be required. I know I'm repeating myself here, but trust me, it'll still be faster than listening to the original review, where I talk at the pace the characters talk in the actual Siege show. Regardless, in Siege, Hasbro ain't doing Legends anymore. They decided to switch things up and focus on Micromasters. 2 Micromasters per set, price of a Legends figure per pack. On paper that's easy enough to understand, but in practice people assume they aren't getting that much value for money, and as a result these things have shelf-warmed worldwide. Hell, it's in the latter half of 2020 and I can still find Wave 2 on shelves. Seriously, there's just no love for these things, and it's a real shame. Why? Well, let's take a look at the last 4 sets in the line and see just what they have to offer. If you've seen the original review, you know exactly how this is going to be set up. So, without further ado, admittedly, I'm going to be a bit biased towards these two. The Sports Car Patrol was the first Micromaster set I ever received, although I wouldn't exactly call it nostalgia considering I only got them 5 years ago. Regardless, Blackjack and Hyperdrive are your typical run-of-the-mill wave filler re-decos, which does seem a little odd considering these two occupied a wave all on their own. Mayhaps they were just biding time until the tail end of the line. Gotta say, these things are really snazzy in these new colours. Blackjack kinda makes sense since black re-decos always look better than the more vanilla variety, it's just the law of repaints. It also helps that the windows are fully painted this time, not sure what Swindler was trying to accomplish. And yes, full disclosure, these have had repro labels applied. Even so, out of the box I think this is a massive improvement. It's not surprising, but it is greatly appreciated. Hyperdrive was a surprise though. Looking at the stock photos, I was expecting him to be somewhat boring. It ended up being the opposite. The blue really works on this mold, and brings out the detail way more than the red did. And again, it definitely helps that the windows were painted properly this time, although in this instance it's more of a QC conundrum. Repro labels or not, this set really holds its own against the somewhat generic Race Car Patrol. It's weird, yet still neat how these feel like their own figures, despite being a mere palette swap. That said, as far as the vehicle modes are concerned, I do feel the originals had more style to them. Don't get me wrong, I'm in no way obsessed with G1 accuracy, but when putting them side by side, the G1 versions just had a bit more pizzazz. For this release, I understand that limitations had to be made. These are simple repaints as far as the vehicle modes are concerned, so you can't expect everything to be as amazing when it comes to their more mobile form. That said, this case is somewhat unique. This particular mold seems to be made this way with this redeco option in mind. Each car is a sort of amalgamation of each character, and as such you lose a lot of nuances that may have been kept if these were separate molds. This is a shame as it not only lowers the uniqueness of the design, but it also locks off the option to tackle some more interesting members. I would have loved for them to try Detour or Tailspin, but thanks to the circumstances that won't happen. Doubly so considering they abandoned ship on this line after poor sales in Earthrise. They died so Legends could live, I guess. Still, with all of that said, as redecos they're pretty damn neat. Everything that you loved about the originals, if you loved the originals like I did, is present and accounted for. Big chunky yet aerodynamic front section on Blackjack, awesome angles on Hyperdrive. I already liked the originals and everything continues to work very, very well. Although I suppose I never really discussed the sizes in the original video, so I guess I'll go over it here. These are, in essence, slightly denser than Legion figures. They have the same plastic quantity as what you'd see in the Bumblebee Speed Series line, but it's packed into a much smaller package. I think this is initially what put people off when deciding whether to buy these or not. They were willing to accept it at regular scale figures, mostly, but when you get to this tiny size, it might have been too big a pill to swallow, or I suppose a pill too small to yada yada yada. Anyway, I'm honestly surprised with the transformation. Don't get me wrong, conceptually it's the exact same, however the tolerances do seem to be greatly improved from the earlier versions of the mold, not from the G1 versions. That's not to say the Race Car Patrol was bad during transformation, but especially on Blackjack's hood and Hyperdrive's legs, everything feels much smoother than before. Guess they had a knee-jerk reaction after the Rescue Patrol and went into full-on damage control mode, not that I'm complaining. And in robot mode, this is where you realize these aren't redecos at all. They're retools! Of course, not a lot has been retooled, just the section that houses the chest and the head. Gotta say, the results are definitely mixed. Blackjack is easily better. Whilst the heads are neck and neck in terms of quality, and yes, that pun was intentional, the chest detail easily wins on the newer edition. Once again, the repro labels are giving him an unfair advantage, but even in the stock configuration, the new midriff does wonders for the design. Sadly, Hyperdrive got the short end of the stick. The detail is immensely reduced in comparison to Road Handler, and the yellow paint is done slightly thinner too. It's not bad by any means, but it's clear which one is worse. The blue paint around the visor, however, definitely is bad. It's incredibly messy and applied on way too thick, meaning that the little detail they have there is instantly lost. And even then, the sculpt work on the original version is just better. That said, once again, the colors as a whole still put these above their predecessors. The light blue easily trumps the somewhat generic reds, and the black, well, we know how black and purple repaints go. There's a reason Skywarp was made an exclusive twice, and why the Netflix team chose Hotlink for their TV-inspired line. Also Barricade. Barricade exists too. And bringing out the originals for a comparison, these two are obviously an upgrade. However, there are some areas where I feel they fell flat. The head sculpts in both instances aren't as good, which is weird since I haven't come across a case like this with any of the other Micromasters, yet anyway. Furthermore, Hyperdrive uses yellow plastic instead of paint, so obviously it's going to look way better. Blackjack also has way more purple due to the use of plastic instead of paint, but in this instance I can let it slide considering modern budgets. Aside from that though, it's obvious that the proportions and articulation are going to be better. Speaking of, it's identical to the Race Car Patrol, so you do get quite a bit in comparison to other Legion figures of the time. Well, I say at the time, but there haven't actually been any Legion class figures in 2020. It's probably why the world is going to shit, to be honest. And size-wise, yeah, they're Micromasters alright, not sure what you're expecting. Budgets are pretty specific for this size class, so you're not going to get a lot of leeway. In the end though, I definitely recommend getting these over the originals. Repro labels will know they exude way more personality, despite some minor downgrades. Funnily enough, there is a variant that features the original sculpting. Whether this was intentional or a factory error remains to be seen, but I haven't seen any evidence of this variant outside of Australia, but you'll probably enjoy these either way. Just note that much like the originals, the gun modes are a bit rubbish. But anyway, that basically covers the redecos in this line until we discuss the 10-pack in a later video, but that's another story for another time. So for now, moving on to Wave 4. Unfortunately, at this point, Hasbro Australia had well and truly given up on stocking shelves with any more Micromasters. To be honest, I don't even recall any cases of these being cited in Australia, so much like Impactor and the original Mirage, I believe these were skipped entirely. Could be wrong though, and feel free to correct me in the comments. But anyway, this time the selection is a little more well thought out. Yeah, I would have liked High Jump to maybe have been swapped out with Mudslinger, especially with Grease Pit coming out in the Generation Selects line later this year, or next year if EB Games keeps up with their delays. But I'm definitely glad that Powertrain got his shot. It's not just because this led to a nice companion piece for Ironworks thanks to the 10-pack. Powertrain is a remarkable little Micromaster on his own terms. Right off the bat, this orange is absolutely wonderful. It's almost on the edge of neon and gaudy, but pulls back just enough so it still retains that vibrancy. It also allows for all the magnificent detail to really shine through, and dear god, there's a lot, especially on the sides. They've really gone all out. The paint also works really damn well. It's not a crazy amount, but what we do have, especially in the blue, works really well. I also love how they've kept all the windows painted, which is actually something that the Iron Tread redeco down the line sadly wasn't able to accomplish. And yes, this was part of the paint layout of the original, but they could have easily omitted it for budgetary reasons. Gotta say, really glad they didn't. And speaking of the original, man, this blows it out of the water. Beyond the simple elements, such as the grille no longer stopping short to make way for the head, there are tons of minor adjustments that make this thing exude way more power. The nose section has been lengthened, which both ups the realism and the boxiness. The more angled nature of the front really works in his favour. The back is a smidge messier, but as a small sacrifice for articulation, I'll take it. Plus, this time they've actually moulded in a trailer hitch, which is a very nice touch. The new wheel arches are also quite good and complete the overall aesthetic. The original does seem a little incomplete in comparison, so in this case the decision on which is the better of the two alt modes is a clear-cut case. The only thing I could really criticise is the use of a fake wheel towards the back. On first glance it doesn't make much sense, considering it's actually a separate piece, but then you realise it's dangerously close to the knee hinge. This indicates that this decision isn't Hasbro being cheap, but rather a limitation of the engineering. Besides, even the original had this issue as well, however it executed it far less elegantly. Either way, Siege absolutely demolishes its predecessor in pretty much every category. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for High Jump. As far as the vehicle mode is concerned, I'm sorry, but to me it just looks bloated. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't outright call it bad, but it doesn't seem to have the same compact nature that the rest do. It almost feels like an oversized KO from certain angles. There are a few things I like, such as the decision to convert the obnoxious red hinge into a sort of bike rack. The silver paint accents really help sell you on this effect. I also really like that they've gone to the trouble of painting the gas canister, something which his successor wouldn't bother with, leading to a repro label situation. The detail on the hood is also much better, featuring many indents and air vents that weren't present on the original. It's also nice that they molded in a sunroof, pretty neat. But other than that, I don't know, it just feels cartoony in some areas, places and haphazard in others. For starters, the side of the car is pretty bad, with windows that don't line up and awful seam-line separation. Honestly, it's giving me classic Ironhide vibes, and the less said about that toy the better, although whether it's worse than the Earthrise version remains to be seen. I'm not touching that with a 10km pulse. Shattered glass, take my money! I get that these things are tiny, but no other Micromasters in Siege or Earthrise compares to the messiness that High Jump portrays. And beyond that, there's the aforementioned bloatedness. All of his edges capture that halfway space between soft edges and hard corners. Since the design doesn't really commit to either, it ends up seeming more like a bad copy of a smaller design, hence the upscaled KO feel. It's not helped by the hollow feel of the figure, but I can easily let that slide given the budget. On its own, this figure is kinda but when compared to the original, you quickly realize what you're missing. The original High Jump isn't the cleanest Micromaster, but the sharp edges really help bring this design to life. Again, I'm not obsessed with G1 accuracy, but putting these two side by side quickly shows the discrepancies in design philosophy. This design could have easily been so much better, since there's a lot they could have improved upon the original. In some respects, they did, like the bike rack, but in others, they just did the bare minimum. Like, couldn't they have fixed the window color? No, not G1 enough? Okay, I guess. Once again, though, it's not a bad alt mode, it's just a slightly underwhelming one, especially when placed next to the awesomeness of Powertrain. I feel that maybe if he was a little smaller, they could have squeezed more of the budget into the mechanical detail, but that would have caused issues with the combined mode, so that's a can of worms I don't want to open. Regardless, I still think these two make a pretty damn good team in vehicle mode, even if Powertrain is doing all the heavy lifting. Not gonna lie though, the transformation for both of these guys isn't the best in the line. Powertrain's backpack is a little annoying, and High Jump's legs feel off somehow. I can't really put my finger on it, but still, neither of these are anywhere near as bad as Ravage, so take that as you will. And robot mode, yeah, it's pretty much the same situation again. Brilliant Powertrain, lackluster High Jump. Right off the bat, the combination body type that Siege and Earthrise Micromasters adhere to works great for Powertrain, since that's how the original rolled as well. Everything here is a massive step up though. For starters, yes, there's far less black plastic, but the color layout is still way better. The blue paint really shines through, yet somehow brings the overall design together. I'm really happy with how the head was handled too. They've kept the somewhat weird design, but streamlined it so that it doesn't look like a squished gremlin. Really glad the ear spikes make a return. They're such a cool design choice. They've also done a really good job of updating the chest. It's a smidge annoying that it gets cut off a bit, but the silver grille works way better than the original grey. The paint is also much clearer, which helps. I also love the line detail on the arms. It really sets him apart from the other War for Cybertron Micromasters. Honestly, this is a near-perfect Micromaster robot mode. Until you get to the back. Honestly, the size of it doesn't bother me. Given the combining gimmick and the size of the toy, as well as the updates made to the proportions of the robot mode, I can easily let this slide. Plus, it's not like this hampers articulation in any way, since it easily moves out of the way for the waist and hips. The problem is it doesn't lock in anywhere. I really wish there had been some grooves that allowed it to tab in, but nope, it just flops around. It's a bit of a shame, honestly, but hey, it's still a pretty damn good robot mode. And, predictably, High Jump is a mess. There's honestly not much I like about this robot mode. Everything is so underdone. The head sculpt takes the sharp helmet and converts it into a sort of mullet, which I didn't even realize a robot mode could have. It looks hella ugly, as does the chest. There's just nothing here aside from some incredibly messy red paint. It just kind of fades out as if it was rushed at the factory. The rest of the paint is also pretty boring, with not much to break up the overall design. At least in the vehicle mode you have the windows to draw your attention, but here you only have the gas canister. This is also one of the few cases where I feel the backpack is a bit much. It pushes the hollowness just beyond my limits and hangs ridiculously low down. The top part doesn't even lock in place either, and since this is a visible backpack as opposed to Powertrain's hidden one, I do actually think this is unacceptable. And look where the wheels ended up! When you have something this clunky, couldn't you just leave them on the back? No, well I guess it's got built-in dual discs! This is really lame. Give me a call when they're playing on motorcycles instead. Legitimately, this is the one case in the whole line where I feel that not only is the vehicle mode superior on the G1 version, but also the robot mode. Yikes, I kinda feel blasphemous saying that. But seriously, the Man of Boxes motif is completely lost on this version since they have to cram in the 5mm torso port. High Jump's torso is very specific in its design, but going in a new direction isn't in itself a bad thing. Every other Micromaster has been able to get around that issue. If it was really going to be such an issue, why not just make Tote instead? He already has the faux chest, so putting a 5mm port there shouldn't be an issue. And it's not like the redeco options are any less than what they ended up going with. Raikon isn't based on anything. It's basically the deco designer's OC, so maybe put Mudslinger instead, so that we have a partner for Grease Pits. It's really disappointing, because Powertrain on his own is really bloody good. If High Jump was even passable, this could have easily been one of the best Micromaster sets in the whole trilogy, or, well, duology. But the amateurish design choices here seem really baffling. I can see so much potential here, but alas, it just gets squandered. Anyway, articulation for both of them is pretty average, going for the hinged knees instead of the ball-jointed ones, for obvious reasons. And size-wise, High Jump's bloatedness really becomes apparent. He needed to be smaller and better engineered, but unfortunately they couldn't do that because they had to engineer in the combined weapon mode. Speaking of, it's about as awful as you'd expect. Once again, Powertrain is trying really hard, but High Jump is just not giving a The thing is, you've got extra slots here that could easily allow you to lock in the legs properly, but nope, they don't even bother. Still, when you separate them, at least you can get rid of the grey truck tumor. On its own, Powertrain does a passable job of being a backwards truck target master. The only thing I find frustrating is that the two ports bend inwards, an issue that was actually corrected for Iron Tread, and thank fuck for that because Ironworks needs a partner. Because Powertrain isn't going to have that sort of functionality with anyone else though, it's easily ignored. But between these two, it's really hard to recommend this set. It's a duo of extreme highs and extreme lows, and unless you're a massive fan of the original Off-Road Patrol, you may find yourself disappointed. Personally, even without these, my love for small-scale Transformers allows me not to regret this purchase, but when you hear people complain about this size class as a whole, this set does nothing to rebut those arguments. So, the first unit of the Spy Patrol, or Soundwave's cassette minions, for anyone with the slightest knowledge of the franchise, was, not well received. Most of the complaints can be boiled down to Laserbeak's visor for not being G1 enough, despite the fact it is G1 from the first episode of the cartoon, and Ravager's overcomplicated transformation. Personally, I never had an issue with the latter, and I would have claimed people were overreacting, but then I had a customer at work who was on the Spectrum actually request the staff members to turn his second copy into cassette mode so he could permanently keep one in each mode, since he was physically incapable of doing it himself. This isn't a joke. Certain people are physically unable to transform Ravage. And yes, I understand that not every toy should be the simplest thing on the planet, but since that event I've come to realize that Hasbro kind of f***ed up, especially for a figure that's supposed to be simple given its price point. After the failure of the first unit, the pressure was on to deliver a properly engineered follow-up. Ultimately, it didn't mean jack shit for us Aussies though, because thanks to stores massively overstocking Wave 2 to the point where it's still on f***ing shelves, Wave 5 never made it to our shores. This much I can confirm, more so than Wave 4. Pretty much everyone over here had to resort to sourcing from overpriced overseas sellers. Was it ultimately worth it? For this set, f*** no, but it's still decent. Right off the bat, the use of the metal pins has been carefully thought out so these actually look like cassettes. Personally, I don't mind the data slab look of the original two, but it was a complaint I heard quite often, so I understand why they went ahead with the design change. And granted, I have once again applied repro labels so these look even closer to cassettes, but even in their stock configuration, the resemblance is there. Considering this is their main purpose, doubly so now that we're actually getting a Soundwave that doesn't turn into a block of nothing, it's definitely not a change I hate. Draw from the back, these pretty obviously look like robots lying down, even more so than the originals, but it's a small price to pay for the incorporation of simpler conversions. And when you take into account the size of these things, the same concessions that are made for other Micromasters quickly get applied here as well. Since these modes are ultimately meant to be accessories for a larger robot, I don't really have much to say about them. They do their job well enough, and anyone who owns Soundwave, no not that one, will have a great time. Okay, putting that aside, real talk here. Since my initial snarky mini review that I did last year, I've really lost all fondness for this vehicle mode. It's basically the G1 brick equivalent of one of those Bayverse throwaway Cybertronian modes, except in that case the Hasbro designers have actually done a good job of making them more cohesive recently. Mostly. Legitimately, any of these four cassettes easily outclassed the base figure that they were designed for. Yes, even Ravage. I really should have been harsher on Soundwave, but since time can heal some wounds, it can also make others worse. One thing I barely went over in the initial review, though, was the shield functionality. Yes, this is supposed to be a shield. It is indeed a documented feature, and it's about as shit as you'd expect. I understand why they did it for the sake of intercompatibility, but it's really something you're going to ignore when owning it. These are cassettes, or data slabs, or bra pads, whatever you want them to be as they slot into Soundwave's chest. End of story. So with that out of the way, the transformations are definitely an improvement in comparison to Ravage, or at least to the point where they're more accessible. It's not something most reviewers would think about, but I suppose this is the rare occasion where an experience changes perspective. Frenzy is about as foldy-outy robot-y as you can get, with the only interesting element being how the fists fold in. Ratbat, though, feels a little unfinished. It's not a frustrating transformation by any means, but I feel like it needs more steps somewhere. The head does occasionally get stuck, though. It's not enough to get mad about, but it definitely does make you pause for a moment. And in robot mode, these things look alright. They're nothing groundbreaking, but they get the job done. Many members of the fandom have deluded themselves into thinking that these would somehow be masterpiece quality, but the regular going price for the cassette 4-pack was $80, effectively doubling the budget for each member, and that's not even taking into account markups that most stores placed on them, thanks to low production numbers. As mainline Transformers that have to sit on store shelves, although not in Australia for some stupid reason, they're fine. Ratbat really goes nuts on the mechanical detail, and I am all for it. Seriously, if you're a Gundam marker nutter, you're going to have an absolute field day with all of these greebles on the insides of the wings. Also really glad they went with a toon-accurate head. Again, I don't care for any type of accuracy, but looking at the toy face, yeesh. The back is a bit weird though. I can easily let the wing continuity slide, but the back panel here just seems a bit odd. Maybe it's to make the head easier to transform, but it still looks weird. Still, it's a nice little bat. Now, I don't have the G1 version to compare it to, but I do have a knockoff Ratbat and a legitimate wing thing from the Masterpiece line. Next to these two, these both have their strengths and weaknesses. I definitely prefer the proportions and transformation on the Masterpiece version, but the detail on the Siege one absolutely knocks it out of the park. Seriously, I cannot wait until this guy gets redone in orange. It's gonna be so f***ing sweet. Anyway, articulation is very limited, but as a cassette I fully understand. The only properly articulated cassette cons I've seen are the MMC ones, and those aren't meant to fit into Soundwave's chest, so certain liberties can be taken. And size-wise, he's got a substantial wingspan, so you should be able to get some decent poses. I do wish he had a stand port though, and the same applies for Laserbeak as well. Both could really benefit from that. Hell, he can't even perch on Soundwave's arm. Now that is a missed opportunity. It walks the line of acceptable and unacceptable in terms of functionality, and when you see that Laserbeak was able to achieve such, you quickly become annoyed. Still, it doesn't ruin the figure. He's definitely fun, as is also the case with Frenzy. Now, addressing the elephant in the room, yes, he is quite wide. He's not quite the chonk man that Ravage is, but he definitely makes some sacrifices in his proportions. Given the budget, it's not really feasible to have the torso extend, so I do get why this is the case. Many are outright refusing to buy this set since Frenzy is not masterpiece quality, and honestly I don't get it. Even putting that aside, it's a pretty fun figure. Again, the detail is brought out a lot more due to the repro labels, but even in its stock configuration... Wait, how many times have I said this already? What I mean to say is it looks great out of the box. You also get a lot of play value out of the blast effect ports on his fists. Again, whilst many have criticized this quote-unquote blemish on the sculpt work, the play options added easily make it worth it in my humble opinion. It's even made better with the articulation, which is surprisingly good. Honestly, when I saw that the hips weren't ball joints, I was concerned, but seeing that they've been substituted with universals, there's basically not much I could ask for under the current budget. Well, maybe an elbow, but I think that's asking too much. Yeah, compared to the Masterpiece version, or Enemy at least. He's obviously not going to be the most amazing thing on the planet, but he's still quite fun. What I don't understand is how people insist this is somehow a downgrade from the original. Have you seen the original lately? They actually have similar proportions, minus the leg lengths. And how does less articulation outclass more? Sure, the head reveal isn't as good, but over everything else, sorry man, I just can't agree. Anyway, he's surprisingly the exact same height as the other Micromasters, but given his wideness, you never really notice it until you put them side by side. And no, there is no way to combine these two. Well, officially at least. By maneuvering the pegs in a specific way, you can actually turn Ratbat into a jetpack for Frenzy. It's clear this wasn't intentional, as the fit isn't perfect, but it's definitely more solid than other fan modes. I do find it funny that the unofficial combination ends up being way better than any of the previous official ones. Goes to show how awful the weapons have been in this line. Well, except for one example. It's pretty rare for any line to save the best for last. Typically, the last wave holds that ever so elusive mold that had very little time spent on it, yet for some reason it remains ridiculously unattainable. Yet somehow, Siege did this for every single size class, going out with a complete and utter bang. Well, except in Apeface's case. Don't get me wrong, the hate is completely unjustified. He's quite fun, but gotta say the Seeker mold is just a tiny bit better. Anyway, right when they announced that they were redoing the Micromasters, the Combiner squads were the figures I desired the most. Although they didn't tackle any of the ones I have personally, they did eventually deliver on what I assume is one of the more popular attempts. Direct Hit and Power Punch make up a third of the battle squad and represent their team pretty excellently in the line. The choice to go with these two was a pretty good idea. Looking at pictures of the older versions, the other options were a clunky Blackbird and a truck towing a tank. Yeah, neither of these seem like good options. Anyway, Direct Hit forms the front, and on his own, he does actually form a somewhat cohesive vehicle. Right off the bat, and take a shot every time I say right off the bat, they've really upped the sculpted detail and paintwork on this thing. Sure, once again, full disclosure, I've added repro labels, but in this instance, he really doesn't need them. I thought they would be pretty neat to have, but as far as the vehicle mode is concerned, it already holds its own perfectly. They've taken the back section and added a ton of black and gunmetal paint. So you're not just stuck with a sea of blue. They've also sculpted a tiny turret, which is a feature they didn't have to do, but it massively elevates the design. And sure, it doesn't look great from the back, but hey, it has to combine, so it's not really a priority. At least the combiner port tucks away nice and neatly. It also comically has its own little blast effect port. Not sure why they bothered though, maybe as a rocket booster? Guess it checks out. More blast effect ports is better than none at all. Power Punch, however, yeah, he turns into the back of a truck. They do try to make it alright on its own with some extra detail and paint on the front. Maybe it could pass for a tank drone with no proper seating area for a driver since it doesn't require one, but that requires a few mental hoops to jump through. Honestly, I don't mind though, since they have at least given some pretty nice details. The gun section has actually received a pretty nice overhaul, with extra pistons at the base and a barrel that actually looks like a barrel, as opposed to a pool noodle. At least I assume anyway. As I said, I don't have the originals, I'm just going off photos online, and that thing looks like a pool noodle. This at the very least looks mean, even in hot pink. Leave it to the Decepticons to make such a color look menacing. Gotta give props though, they've actually managed to somewhat mask the 5mm port on top. You don't tend to notice it, which is evidence of great design work. But keeping them separate was never the main intent. Oh no, smoosh them together and you've easily got the best goddamn vehicle of the line. This thing works amazingly, and all of the detail lines up superbly. Even though it goes from black to light blue, the through line between the vehicle modes is not lost at all. The gun also sits incredibly well along the roof of the vehicle, falling into the indent of the turret. Would have been nice if it was a little sturdier, but it works well enough, at least for small blast effects. Legitimately, I wish we'd gotten more of this style of set instead of the constant barrage of cars and trucks, but well, I suppose these guys aren't as repaintable. While we're here though, thanks to this specific combination, this easily turns into the best weapon of the set. All you really have to do is turn it over and voila, it's a rocket launcher. Pairing this with Legends figures especially really pushes forth the powerful aesthetic. You even get to utilize head swivels so that you don't end up with visible head syndrome. Pretty neat touch, right, Battle Patrol? Also, these blast effect ports can act as thrusters for the vehicle mode. Rocket car, motherfuckers! Yeah! Anyway, size-wise, of course, the combined truck is going to be pretty big for the size class, but even separated, these guys are quite bulky. Their designs very effectively break up the somewhat monotonous lineup we've been seeing. And yes, many of these sets have been good, but damn, this is better. Transformation-wise, they may seem fairly similar to each other, but compared to the other Micromasters, they're a nice change of pace. Yeah, the cassettes were different in their own right, but they were taking conversions from other versions of the character anyway. This is the first time in this new rendition of the size class where we've experienced a unique spin on the Micromaster conversion scheme, and I'm all for it. Yes, Power Punch's shoulders can be a bit annoying, but it's all pretty damn good and pretty damn refreshing. And in robot mode, these two easily convey the motto of simple but effective. They're basically using the Man of Boxes motif that High Jump should have embodied, which is actually a little different from their rather scrappy predecessors. As you might have guessed, it once again works incredibly well. It's clear the designers had a fondness for the originals, but they were smart enough to update what needs fixing. Honestly, Direct Hit may very well be my favourite Micromaster of the whole trilogy. His head sculpt is absolutely immaculate, his paintwork is done exceptionally well, and this time, since we're not dealing with that bloody annoying belly cavity, it actually gets a chance to shine. Even his back section remains surprisingly clean, probably due to the boxy aesthetic lending itself well to a robot of this style. And there's no way this guy is going to fall over with bloody awesome heel struts. Unfortunately, Power Punch isn't as well realised, but it's still pretty good. You've still got the utterly amazing mechanical detail, and the paintwork is on full display, and to be honest, I prefer the thruster motif to the truck boots. Unfortunately, this time you do have to contend with practically the entire alt mode sitting on the back. It's not as bad as, say, High Jump, because you've at least got a smoother profile that actually serves a purpose, i.e. the big f***-off cannon, but it's a smidge annoying. And yeah, the head sculpt isn't as good either. Much like Hyperdrive, it's one of those visor but somehow fully painted types of faces, and also like Hyperdrive, it's woefully sloppy. I'd say that because it's yellow, it's even worse, because yellow has a tendency to be really messy, but yeah, it's not a deal breaker. Direct Hit is basically the powertrain of this set, yet unlike the Off-Road Patrol, he actually has a competent member to back him up. Then you bring in the extra mechanical detail, the awesome paints, and the actual functional weapon in the combined mode. Yeah, this thing is easily the best Micromaster set of the whole damn trilogy, hands down. Articulation is pretty solid, although Power Punch unfortunately has to contend with only hinged knees instead of ball joints, and he shares the issue with Big Shot and Red Hot in the sense that the head is a little bit difficult to reach inside the cavity. Still, both come with turning heads, which is definitely appreciated given the way they transform. And size-wise, once again, these things are pretty chunky fellas. Their chunkiness combined with the paint and sculpting easily put all the other members to shame. Honestly, I don't think that Hasbro can top these in the final wave. I mean, it's possible, but it definitely seems unlikely. Don't get me wrong, I'm very excited to complete this series, especially considering the Astro Squad is using official NASA licensing, much like Skylinks. Doubt it'll be able to overthrow the king of the line though, and even if they did, it's going to be a while before I get these. I don't even think they're coming to Australia at this point, if Siege was anything to go by. And hey, apparently the rest of the world had issues with stock for these guys too, so they decided to cap off Earthrise with the Battle Squad 2. He's just that good. So good that he needs to close off both Micromaster lines. Guess my mostly American audience has no excuse not to buy these now, so go on, go out and buy them right now. Actually, maybe not, current apocalypse and all. Going over these again for the purpose of reviewing them really makes me wish that these had been continued into Kingdom, but I suppose that's not what the fandom wants. Ultimately, I think the reasons for their failure, aside from general fan dislike, is the difficulty in marketing them, and the fact that stores massively overordered them, which, even putting the fandom aside, likely led many average consumers to pine for that classic Legends experience. I mean, what alternative do they have, the f***ing Authentics? Gotta say though, as far as Siege was concerned, they really ended on a high note. So, final verdicts. Honestly, I don't see any reason to get the Race Car Patrol over these two. The colours are far better, the tolerances are massively improved, making for a much more fun experience during transformation. All around, it is a much better experience. The Off-Road Patrol, however, is a bit more difficult to recommend. It has its high points, but it also has its downsides. I think I'd really only recommend these for completionists like myself and massive fans of the original. Even if you've owned the originals and you're not that fond of them, Yeah, you might as well skip them. Damn though, the Spy Patrol 2nd unit. These are criminally underrated. There's a lot of fun to be had, but given the failures of the Laser Beacon Ravage set, many people have just ignored them. These are definitely a lot of fun, and they're definitely going to look amazing in orange and EVA Unit 1 colours. But even ignoring that newer release, these are a must-have for anyone who wants some accessories for their Soundwave. As for the Battle Squad, even if you're not the biggest fan of Micromasters, you really should be hunting this thing down. Even ignoring people's hatred for the size class, he is easily one of the best Legends experiences we've had in the past few years, and you'd be an absolute fool to not at least sample that. And with the Earthrise reissue coming up eventually, well, you've got no excuse. And that finally brings the Micromaster lineup in Siege to a close. It would have been done a lot sooner on this channel if the stores hadn't f***ed over distribution. It's been a long time coming, but I had a lot of fun looking over these again, and I guess I'll see you next time. Or if you only watch the Micromaster videos, I guess I'll see you next year, because that's how long they take to come out!